Thank you. Gosh, this is a book worth reading, and therefore all of you are here. It's a Friday evening, and we have a full house. So, thank you, Taylor, for making the time for us on your trip to India. Your book has, as we were just saying, has been something that so many of us at CPR have read and learned from, and drawn from it in different ways in all our policy work today. So it's an extremely relevant contemporary book that gives us so much, and I think that this really is a book that should be put in every public policy course there is out there in India today. So thanks a lot for coming here to talk to us about your book. On behalf of CPR, I've been asked to just do a formal introduction to you before I hand over to you. So Taylor Sherman, who was born in the United States and is professor of modern South Asian history at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her previous work includes state violence and punishment in India and Muslim belonging in secular India, negotiating citizenship in postcolonial Hyderabad. The book that Taylor is going to talk about actually, I think, builds on both your previous books in a really substantial way, and you say that too in your book. Nehru's India, A History in 7 Myths, begins by re-evaluating the role of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, in shaping the nation. It argues that the notion of Nehru as the architect of independent India, as well as the ideas, policies, and institutions most strongly associated with his premiership, non-alignment, secularism, socialism, democracy, the strong state, and high modernism, have become myths. Sherman then presents a new, nuanced interpretation of the Nehru years in Indian history. This is, for me, a book about the history of the making of the modern Indian state, particularly in those very crucial years, the kind of institutions that we built, the kind of engagement of the actors involved, the ideologies of the time, and how it all collectively shaped India in that very crucial period. It's deeply, deeply researched and just filled with insight. So really looking forward to your talk. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Yamini. Thanks to CPR and to... Is that on? Can you hear me? A bit closer. Yeah? So thank you to CPR, to Yamini, to Priyadarshini, to Sushant for having me here. To those of you watching at 1.5 speed on YouTube afterwards, thanks for watching. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. I'll start with, in the normal way, with its origins. So I was working on this project, Muslim Belonging in Secular India. This was my second book project, and of course I was reading naturally about secularism, what had been written about secularism in the late 20th and early 21st century. I'm sure you're all familiar with the debates about secularism, and especially about Nehru's secularism that are present today. But what I found was that the different options available for how to understand secularism in the Nehru years, they didn't fit with what I was finding in the archival sources. So I thought to myself, maybe the other terms that we associate with Nehru, the so-called Nehruvian consensus, right, non-alignment, socialism, etc., maybe all those other terms might not work the way we think they do in the 21st century. And so the aim of the book has been to understand how the people at the time used these concepts, how they used the term, how I wanted to uncover the debates that they had about these various ideas. I wanted to explore the projects that they undertook that were underpinned by these ideas. And I was also keen to, in particular, to discover how by the end of the Nehruvian period, how people of the time in the 60s evaluated the successes and failures of the projects that they had undertaken during the Nehru years. I also wanted to ask, is that all there is? Right? We have the Nehruvian consensus, and there's about 7 or so abstract nouns. Is that it? Surely the era was more interesting and complicated than that. So the result was this book, and I've given you the table of contents there. What I hope is that you will not look at the table of contents and then assume that India was not secular. in the Nehru years. Oh, socialism, no, didn't have socialism. Oh, didn't have a strong state, wasn't non-aligned. Those are not my arguments, okay? What I say at the end of the book is that each of these is a myth, but they're all myths in their own ways. So in some cases, there was the goal, for example, for non-alignment, there was a goal that wasn't achieved. In other places, there's a question, the myth is there because we've misunderstood the definition of the term, and I think that's the case with socialism, for example. In some cases, there was never an intention, and it was never realized, and that's, I think, the case with a couple of other myths. So each is a myth in its own way. Today, I'm not going to take you through all 7 myths. There's no time to do that. I want to give you a little bit of a start. I want to start out with Nehru and the myth of Nehru, the architect of independent India, because I think it's a good starting point. And then I want to give you, so what I don't want everyone to walk away from this book thinking is, okay, well now how do I talk about Nehru's India? Do I have to put socialism in quotation marks and secularism in non-alignment in quotation? Is that the big takeaway from this? No, I think there's an alternative characterization possible for this era. And so with this presentation, I'd like to give you that alternative characterization. So we'll talk about Nehru, and then I'll give you the alternatives. Okay, so we must start with Nehru. Let me tell you that in writing this book, I didn't start with Nehru. I am not the kind of historian who is inclined towards great man history. So I wrote the main 6 chapters without any Nehru in them, really, without much Nehru in them. And then I would send them out to friends, and every single one of them came back to me with like, well, this is an okay chapter, but where's Nehru? So I wrote the chapter about Nehru last. And that's a kind of disposition thing. But I want to address this question. I want to talk about the myth of Nehru, the architect. And I want to ask, was Nehru involved in building that myth? In other words, did he cultivate a kind of cult of personality, even a soft one? And my answer is no, and I'll show you why. And then I want to look at how the myth was propagated, particularly after his death. So, I've already answered this question. Did Nehru propagate a cult of personality? I would argue no. It's been alleged, however, that he did. That allegation was put forward by Zarir Masani in a documentary in 2007, I believe. But it's also part of the kind of both sides-isms of today's debates about Modi, right? So if we have Modi creating a kind of cult of personality, well, Nehru must have done it too. So, but actually, if you look at Frank de Kooter's definition of a cult of personality, here's what it involves. The elevation of a single man above all others, the imbuing his leadership with a kind of mystical air, the strict regulation of the production of images about that man, and the ruthless demand for loyalty. And Frank de Kooter, I think his book is called How to Make a Dictator or something like that, and he gives you the typical people, Stalin, Mao, and Nehru is not in his book. Let's ask, does Nehru fit this definition of a cult of personality? Well, if you look at his, I think, the best biography of him by Sarvepalli Gopal, he charts Nehru's introspection and his ambivalence about his own power. Nehru is known to have liked a joke, of course, famously, even about himself. Stalin did not have a sense of humor about himself. Nehru professed to being, quote, allergic to having things named after himself. And he actually had to plead with the public, stop asking me, because the answer is no. In 1957, Nehru was approached with the idea of a book of extracts from his speeches titled, quote, Nehru's Wisdom. And he cavilled at this pompous title and said no. So this is several years before Mao's Little Red Book. Nehru could have had his own Little Red Book, but he didn't want anything of it. And so what I think he doesn't meet any of the tests for creating a cult of personality around himself. And he managed to keep the Congress Party from creating one during his lifetime. All impulses towards iconization, I argue, were directed towards Gandhi. So if a road was renamed, it was Mahatma Gandhi Marg, right? Obviously, there's all the currency and stamps, all with Gandhi's image on them. Okay, pictures of Nehru were not in short supply, but the reverence that goes with iconization, that is all directed towards Gandhi. Okay, so if he didn't propagate the myth himself, how was it propagated? Well, in the book, I look at an episode where he wants to retire in 1957, and I argue that that's kind of the origin of the myth. The Congress Party begins to tell him, you can't retire, you're our undisputed, indispensable leader. And so they begin to create this myth around him to keep a tired man at his desk. Well, after Nehru's death, in May 1964, the myth really explodes. So there's the proliferation of Nehru iconography, with the Municipal Corporation of Delhi renames the circular road Jawaharlal Nehru Marg within about 5 days, or maybe 2 weeks of his death. There's the first commemorative coin, the first stamp. What you see here is the second stamp that was issued on his birthday, on the 14th of November 1964. And this stamp is striking because he's in full Roman emperor mode. Yeah? He's looking like Julius Caesar. I really swear to you, Nehru would never have allowed this in his lifetime. Even Gandhi's picture is the kind of, on the coins and on the currency, is a kind of smiling and not at full profile. So this kind of elevation happens after his death. At condolence meetings shortly after he passed away, nationalist leaders led thousands of people in taking a pledge, quote, to follow Mr. Nehru's ideals. That kind of pledge would have been utterly unthinkable just days before. So you have the proliferation of the myth after he dies. There's also some responsibility goes to political parties, of course, in propagating the myth and carrying it on long after 1964. So the Congress, in what used to be statements and are now tweets, lauds him as the architect of modern India on November 14th and May 27th every year. But I also argue that the BJP and other opposition parties have some responsibility for the myth of Nehru the architect. I think they raise him up, if only to throw tomatoes at him. They put him on a pedestal because they want to personify what they characterize as all the mistakes of the era in one person. And as they do that, they imbue him posthumously with extraordinary power. Why? Well, I think a nemesis without power isn't really a villain at all, right? So it wouldn't suit the BJP to acknowledge that Nehru, actually, his power was very diffuse. Okay, how did Nehru see himself? He saw himself as an educator, as a mediator. He understood that he was a symbol in India's democracy, and he used his power as Prime Minister, I argue, to patronize others in their projects, to sponsor others in their projects. Okay, so what I argue is that because he's been lauded as the architect of independent India, at the same time we've got the Nehruvian consensus, which is just repeated again and again and again. But it is possible to characterize India in the Nehru years in a different way. And so I want to give you that characterization. So there are 6 elements to this. I swear they're not, don't worry, they're not that long. So I think the first and probably most important way to characterize the Nehru years is that far from being an era of ideological conformity, this is an age of experimentation. And here we see Nehru acting as patron, a bright, enthusiastic individual with a specialism in statistics or in social welfare would come to Nehru, approach him with an idea to solve a problem. I'd like to start an institute, I'd like to set up a board, and Nehru would jump at the opportunity to sponsor them, and he would make it possible for them to pursue their ideas. I'm going to come back to how they pursued their ideas later. But for these experiments, and they were always called experiments, they deployed all the tools of mid-century social science. So they tended to be started with a pilot project. So rather than rolling out a big bang change of policy, no, we start with a village. Let that pilot project take its course, evaluate it, then make some changes to it, expand it over a larger area, evaluate it, make some changes, and roll it out to the whole country. So this is social science methods, and they're used again and again. And the Planning Commission, which isn't designed to order everyone and control the whole economy is very important for these experiments. They have a program evaluation organization, they oversee the pilots, and they write the reports evaluating the various programs. This idea of the experiment pervades every area of policy, from community development to statistics. So we've got Mahalanobis up there, to social welfare. So Mahalanobis is top right, Durgabai Deshmukh is top left, to international relations. So obviously that's Vijay Lakshmi Pandit on the bottom right. So this is, I think, an important way to understand the Nehru years. The ideas that we now so strongly associate with these years did not come out fully formed. They weren't imposed upon everyone. Okay, the second characteristic of this era, sorry for the errant capitalization there, is there was a comfortable internationalism of the Nehru years. Because of non-alignment, there is this kind of association, this assumption that India was kind of isolated, right? And because of the protections that the government introduced for industry, there's this idea that Nehru's India was closed off from the world. And that, I think, is just utterly untrue. And I would like to give you 3 ways that India was comfortably internationalist. Firstly, Indian diplomats, Nehru, his sister, and a wide cohort of their contemporaries had a vision for international order that was centered on unwinding imperialism and its legacies, on peace and cooperation and establishing a rules-based order, and on careful attention to the will of peoples and protections for minorities. This was a universalist vision. It has long been assumed that the universalist visions of the mid-20th century were Western visions. It was somehow those states that had the right to be universalist in that time. India asserted its own right to be universalist, and they had a vision. The diplomats tried to oversee it. I think this vision is more creative and more ambitious than non-alignment, therefore more interesting. So the second facet of India's internationalism in this period is that they were willing to take on international expertise. So on the right-hand side there, you've got Nehru with Le Corbusier, the architect. But I argue that they were not subservient to that international expertise. So let me give you this example. Le Corbusier visits India for the first time in April 1952, and he met the Planning Commission. And just about the first thing the Planning Commission says to him is, you know, large-scale high-rises don't work in India. That is Le Corbusier's thing in 1952. That's what he does. He does big utopian high-rise buildings, and the Indians meet him and say, we don't do that. And they give him a barrage of questions about affordable housing and affordable materials, and he answers them. They also tell him that they want him to train Indian architects, not to oversee everything, but to train Indian architects to build Chandigarh and then to build the rest of the country. And Le Corbusier agrees. He says, I think this is, I agree with this ambition. So they are taking in international expertise, but absolutely using it for their own advantage and in their own ways, and not sort of being blindly molded to these outside ideas. Finally, the third facet of their internationalism was that India saw itself as a leader in the decolonizing world. So here we've got Appapant. In the middle picture, we've got Appapant and some East African leaders. India saw itself as leading the decolonizing world through its own experience. So they not only helped East Africans and Tibetans make their arguments for independence and for rights, but they also sent experts abroad, mostly via the United Nations, advising on everything from dam building and low-cost housing to the bicycle industry. India was the leading expert of, or saw itself, wanted to be the leading expert of the decolonizing world. Okay, the third facet, the third characteristic of this period is I think we have to bring in bring back the importance of popular participation. So there's a kind of assumption in the scholarship that, an allegation even, that Nehru and the elites around him monopolized all initiative for themselves. And having achieved independence on the back of popular mobilization, they told Indians, okay, abhi baith jao, hum karenge, okay? But that is absolutely not true. There were constant efforts to get Indians, especially in rural areas, to participate in nation building. So the cartoon up there is from the magazine Kurukshetra, which is the community development magazine. Can't read it terribly well, but it basically is looking at all these different programs that the government has developed. And it says, first you had a government program with people's participation, then you have a people's program with government participation, and now, this is 1959, you've got Panchayati Raj, and the idea is the people will govern themselves. Of course, that's not how it worked out, but that was the ambition, and I think it's very important to acknowledge the ambition and to watch and understand why it didn't work out in that way, rather than to assume the state monopolized everything. So I think there's a couple of reasons for the reliance on popular participation. First of all, there's the context of fiscal austerity, right? The state can't do everything because it hasn't got the money for anything. But secondly, and I think this is very important, it was understood that labor was good for the development of one's individual personality. Hard work was good for you, right? This is Gandhi's influence, 100%. Even bigger issues were likely to be devolved to local populations. So in 1961, the government wakes up to the fact that it had promised to introduce primary education for everyone, and they didn't. How do they decide to fulfill that obligation? They ask villages to set up their own schools, donate everything from buildings to musical instruments, rather than taking full control. Now, I think this has interesting consequences. What it does is it reifies India's existing inequalities, right? Imagine a wealthy village just on the outskirts of Chennai, Madras. Of course, they're going to have more resources to put into their school than a remote village that isn't very wealthy. So it's not all hunky-dory and lovely. It does have some important negative consequences. This desire to include the people and demand popular participation applies even to private enterprise. So in 1955, of course, at the Avadi session of the Congress, they decide they're going to pursue a socialistic form of society. Yeah, we all know that. Straight after that, Nehru goes to the FICCI and tells India's biggest industrialists, hey, don't get caught up about words. Yeah, and he tells them that there's going to be a lot of room for private enterprise in the second plan. He asks them to make themselves part of the plan. And this is what's expected of big corporate entities in the Nehru years, in 3 ways. First, look at the plan's targets and work with the government towards them. And this ad you've got up here is Tata Steel saying the government wants to expand its steel capacity. As part of the plan, the government is expanding its steel capacity, and Tata is contributing 1/3 of that extra capacity. And this is an advert taken out in the Times of India. And you see actually similar adverts where you have big industrial enterprises advertising how they're making themselves part of the plan. They're very willing to be part of the plan. Second way they're meant to participate is to pay their taxes. There is a lot less willingness on this front. Yeah. So the third, tax raids are obviously in the news, but they're also in my book. So but they're genuinely trying to get taxes in the 1950s. The third way that businesses are asked to be part of the plan and make themselves part of nation building is through corporate social welfare. So townships were very popular at this time. Obviously drawing on the experience of Tata and Jamshedpur from the early 20th century, you have new enterprises setting up townships, providing housing, schools, playgrounds, everything for their workers. In return, of course, businesses got protections from global markets, help from the government with inputs, quality control, and help with marketing. So it was absolutely a reciprocal relationship. The fifth, I think. I forgot it says. Yeah, fifth. Okay. Might be on the fourth characteristic. But I think it's very important to recognize that those who inherited the colonial administration were reluctant to use it. They didn't take over the levers of the Raj's Leviathan and start operating it as it was. They were very critical of their colonial inheritance. Zakir Hussain, for example, told a group of incoming IAS members that the bureaucracy of the British had a forbidding touch-me-not attitude and, quote, a standoffish sense of superiority, and what's worse, a lack of initiative to boot. Yeah, he told them all that, must have been a bit dispiriting to hear, at an address to the Indian Institute of Public Administration. And you hear this kind of speechifying again and again about how unhappy they are from the bottom to the top with the Indian administration that they inherit. For that reason, the seminal projects of the early 1950s were all built at a distance from the existing administration. So the Planning Commission, the Central Social Welfare Board, the Damodar Valley Corporation, the public enterprises, all of them are set up as autonomous entities with as little interaction with the existing administration as possible. That is a trend that lasts through the 1950s and is wound up a little bit over the early 1960s. So these autonomous bodies are brought under government control in the late 50s, early 60s. Okay, gosh, am I speaking really fast? Sorry, I'm burning through this. Okay, so then the final characterization for this period is that this is the pinnacle of power for India's upper class elites. They are aware of their enormous privilege, but they don't lord it over the rest of the population, and they don't seek to protect their privilege out of a kind of preemptive form of resentment. Instead, they operated in pedagogic mode, seeking to uplift those less fortunate. Of course, we recognize this language as patronizing now, but they used their position to try to transform India. They had a reasonably good understanding of historical change, so they understood that the peaceful revolutions that they were calling for would have consequences that they could neither foresee nor control, and they understood that. Okay, so that's how I would characterize the period. I'm going to end with a little anecdote about some instant feedback I had from a reader recently. So I flew from Sydney to Singapore to get here. Obviously, I then took another flight to Delhi. And I was sitting next to a couple who were near retirement, Indian couple near retirement, and I strike up a conversation with the woman in the middle seat. And it turns out she's a teacher in India, of history no less. So we have a long chat. And we start talking, and her husband perks up his ears, and we start talking, and he quizzes me. He asks me, what do you think about the drain of wealth? I think this is a kind of like a litmus test, right? I think I passed that test, and so then he starts quizzing me on socialism, secularism, and we're really chatting back and forth. So partially to get some peace from this conversation, I actually give him my copy of the book. I say, you can't take it because I have to write these papers that I'm giving, but you can read the book on the plane. And he actually burned through about a quarter or maybe a third of the book in about 2 hours. And as he started reading, he must have read no more than about 2 sentences before he had a comment. Then he read 2 more sentences and he had a doubt. And then another word, he wasn't sure that was the right word. He had an objection. But he began to read with a bit more pace. And then after about 2 hours, he said to me, look, this is really challenging my brain because on one side, I have to hold everything I know about Nehru. And on the other side, I have to hold all the arguments and all the evidence in your book. And my brain is challenged by this. And so I liked that review. And so I hope all the readers will pick up the book with that in mind. And you may not agree with everything that you see in there, but I hope you will enjoy the challenge that it presents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for this wonderful talk and the equally wonderful book. Before I open the talk to the audience for questions, I'll use the privilege of the chair to ask a couple of my questions of my own. So those of you who may not have read the book, there is secularism, there is socialism, there is democracy, there is non-alignment, there is strong state, there is high modernism, which follows the idea that Nehru was not ideally the architect of modern India, among the myths that she takes on in the book. And as she said, she's a great raconteur of anecdotes, and the book is full of anecdotes, whether it's about Faridabad, whether it's about Prohibition in Maharashtra, whether it is about the number of Soviet films who came to India vis-a-vis the number of American films which were broadcast, which were shown in India, or even interesting anecdotes about how Buddhism was being used as a means of gaining international influence and otherwise, and stops being done the moment Ambedkar converts to Buddhism with his followers from the Mahar caste. My simple question is, let's take the myth of non-alignment, for example. Who contributed to the myth? Who created this myth that India was a non-aligned country? If India was not really non-aligned, as you say, it was born out of the British Raj, it had natural ties with the Anglo-American groups, and of course it liked the ideas which were being coming out of Soviet Union. What created this myth about non-alignment, and how has it got so deeply ingrained amongst us that even today everybody talks about the fact that India is going to be the whole world is looking towards non-alignment again as it enters a new Cold War?
Yeah, okay. It's interesting. Everybody comes, my first question this entire trip in Delhi has been about non-alignment. So I'm waiting for 500 PhDs about how India really was non-aligned to be emerging in the next decade. So where does the myth of non-alignment? So here I think this is a myth where there's two sides to this myth. One, it doesn't capture the material reality of India. India wanted to be non-aligned, but was born into alignment with the West. And so the myth in this case is of an ambition that wasn't actually achieved. What are the origins of that myth? First of all, Nehru's words, and his diplomats. They said again and again, India was non-aligned. But saying the words again and again doesn't actually create the balance between the Soviet bloc and the US and the capitalist bloc that would have been required to materially be non-aligned. The second key player in creation of this myth are the Americans, who are so afraid of communism and so paranoid in the 1950s that when Nehru and his diplomats said we are non-aligned, they took that at face value and ignored the large stream of Americans going to India and advising them on various things, and ignored all the trade that they had with India. And so I think the Americans have a lot of responsibility for this. And because scholars have only had access to American archives for a very long time, then the Americans' paranoia and their taking of Nehru's words at face value becomes our truth. So I think there's a couple of different groups that are responsible for this.
And I believe secularism and socialism were the easiest myths for you to tackle. But which was the hardest myth to tackle? Was modernism the hardest myth to tackle? Because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of granular approach to that chapter.
Yeah. So honestly, the hardest myth for me was the myth of Nehru the architect. But that's because of my training. I'm not really trained to look at big men. I look at social and cultural history. So what did I have to do to tackle the myth of Nehru the architect? I had to kill him. I started with his funeral. And I looked at how he was eulogized, and I could see, and I looked at the assessments of his rule or his premiership in the aftermath of his death. And then I saw the documentary that opens the book, and I began to understand how this myth of Nehru the architect was created. But it was very tricky for me to do it because, of course, one's temptation is to go to the selected works. You can literally spend an entire career reading the selected works and never quite getting to grips with everything that's in them. So that was the hardest one for me.
So if Nehru was not the architect of the house in which we all Indians live today, to stretch your metaphor, then what was he? Was he just a patron of like-minded people who were thinking in the same direction, and just bringing them together and asking them to do things?
Yeah, I mean, I think his most important role was as patron, and I think what that does is it shows you how diffuse, it begins to show you how diffuse responsibility was, right? India not only had a federal system, but it also had, because of the legacy of the anti-colonial movement, it had a set of people who were accustomed to disobeying authority, right, who had been trained to disobey authority. And so you have these enthusiastic individuals, you have the federal system, you have habits of governance that mean people don't obey. And so that helps us understand how power worked in the Nehru years, how he didn't try. He was admired, widely admired, but he was constantly trying to devolve power to others.
Yeah. I'll open the floor to the audience. Any questions? Rahul?
Thank you.
Rahul, I think you have to take the mic here.
Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Let me, a very small question, but on the hardest myth you just mentioned. And the reason why I'm asking this question is your focus is that Nehru was not the architect of these myths, and each of these myths have their own stories. And so people who were creating these myths or constructing this myth, each one of them must have their different reasons, right? BJP opposition, as you rightly mentioned, they wanted to personify. Kothari, you mentioned in your first chapter writing, he wrote about Nehru consensus. What I'm not able to understand, what was the reason for Congress party, especially in 1957? I can understand after 62, you want to have a glorified figure which is going to bring you lot many glory, right? But in 57, if I am in the Congress party, I would like Nehru to go, right, like the top leadership, because then others will get a chance. So, and given the position Congress was in, they would not have needed Nehru to win election. They could have been done without him. So what is basically top Congress leadership doing? Why do they want to keep him there? And what is their reason for keeping him?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think there's partially a sense of India sets up a Indian Institute of Public Opinion, and just before the second general election, they begin to survey Indians about the question, after Nehru, who? Yeah? And there's no clear frontrunner. Yeah? So even the Congress, there's a list of about 10 people, and they survey people, and nobody is sailing far into the frontrunner position. And so I think if you have to look at the leadership of the Congress, there's nobody really inspiring with the charisma and the integrity and the track record of Nehru, and also with the public recognition. And so they probably, and now I'm speculating, they want to avoid a long, protracted set of infighting. So let's just keep Nehru in place for a long time. What I think is interesting is after Nehru's death, it's Mrs. Gandhi who does quite a lot of work in propagating the Nehru myth, because her legitimacy is, how do we put it? Not solid. Yeah. And so we see her in 1984, obviously, just before she's assassinated, strongly associating herself with Nehru in order to solidify her legitimacy just at a point when she's most in peril. And so she's got reasons for it afterwards. I think the reasons become more compelling after he dies even, because they lack charismatic leaders with integrity and name recognition, really. Can I just say that I gave a paper the other night and not a single woman asked a question? So women, I'm giving you permission to ask questions.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for that very fascinating discussion. I read the book, and I found it, again, fascinating. My question is on one particular myth, which is the myth of secularism. And when you talk of the myth of secularism in the book, you talk about two aspects of and the quotidian, and between what was a facade and what was the actual foundation of interreligious interaction in post-independent or newly post-independent India. So what I'd like to add is that idea of something being iconic and something being quotidian was true for basically every aspect of life post independence. You come to the Constitution. The Constitution itself was a pedagogical project in many senses. It wasn't a reflection of the kind of society we were, but more of an aspiration. So it was meant to teach democracy to the masses. Now, some of it in the constitutional sense seeped down to the masses. So there was a respect for democracy and a respect for elections or democratic institutions, maybe even in a rudimentary sense. What I want to ask is, why do you think this approach failed for secularism? And do you feel, firstly, do you feel this approach failed for secularism? And secondly, if so, why?
Yes, so did the approach fail for secularism? I mean, I think certainly when you look at the final position of Muslims and of Dalits in 1964, they are both separately, for their own reasons, they are unhappy with the settlements, with secularism as how it operated in the Nehru years. And if secularism was meant to bring these different groups into the nation and make them feel part of it, feel as if they belong and were full citizens, then yes, it failed. Why did it fail? I think we can come back to the limitations of Nehru's power and how his personal vision of secularism, which had to do with drawing on 1,000 years of Indian history and showing that Indians always just lived together peacefully, and we celebrated each other's festivals, and we lived side by side, and we ate together, and therefore that is a way of being secular. That wasn't shared by large numbers of the administration, and it wasn't shared by large numbers of the population. And although I think that's why it failed. I think they had their own vision, and I'm not sure everybody could be characterized as Hindutva at that time. I think that's probably going too far. So they maybe didn't have their own strong vision of an alternative, but on an everyday level, they were not living the everyday secularism that was of Nehru's imagination. Sure, where the mic's gone.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the book a lot, and one of the things that struck me that I've been thinking about is the nature of the elite culture, because I think that in many ways substantively has continued even today. So what I'd like you to reflect on is, in what ways is this culture of myth-making of the big supreme national leader in some ways either continued or is different now? And the other question I had is that what is it about the national culture that makes the national leadership in those policy-making, policy ideational spaces say things that are impossible to implement and are not real and fly in the face of everything that's happening in their own constituencies. So this sort of disjuncture, which I feel was very stark in the chapter on secularism, which is of personal interest. So for example, institutions like the National Emotional Integration Council as a solution for nation building and nation making, and the national integration conferences and those pledges, and I mean, what were they thinking? Even if Nehru disliked it, but what were they thinking? So the broader sort of your thoughts and reflections on the elite culture. And also I sort of noticed that one of the things just now mentioned was that there was this conscious attempt by the elite to bypass the colonial administration and to set up parallel structures. And I think some bit of that continued post the 1990s. Also in the school education reform story, we saw parallel structures being created, and whether that idea sort of continued because that's how the elites thought. Thank you.
I think she's a follow-up.
Sure.
Yeah, similar-ish. I think, so one of the things that I took away from many of, particularly the institution building elements to the narrative, was, as Priyadarshini says, it's a sort of coming together from multiplicity of ideas of the elite, which were then given a certain kind of state patronage, which perhaps at that point in time was a necessary patronage to be able to build up this institutional life. And it kind of, if you look back, in a sense, so much of your book is dotted with institutions and ideas that just failed. Okay, and I wonder if part of that, including actually secularism, which I would treat very differently to some of the other parts of the book, but part of that is also because there already was a conscious and subconscious myth-making of Nehru, the architect of modern India, that existed in the way in which the structures of power and politics were organized at that point in time, which didn't feel the need to actually generate a grassroots consensus around things. So you spoke just in response to Rahul's question, you mentioned the opinion polls and after Nehru what, which was one of the big reasons why the Congress party didn't necessarily want power to be given up at that point in time. That's all part of the process of myth building. And I wonder how much that came to play. The other question I had, which is close and different, is there also was, you spoke about it in the people's participation story, there is also an interpretation, if you look at the constitutional debates, of the importance of building a modern nation state that was in some ways distanced from the people in order to be able to be the sort of instrument through which social change, which Nehru believed very strongly that blocks of India needed this deep social change, and coming at it from a slightly different perspective to Ambedkar, but the two I think aligned a lot stronger on this idea. So parts of the institution were built, parts of the state were built necessarily as elite state. And then, I mean, I always read the community development, Panchayati Raj, people's participation stuff, not so much as ownership or active participation or what we call active citizenship as such, and much more an imagination of a people that needed to participate in their own social change, which needed an external transfer. So, and again, I see that a lot in how I read. I mean, after all, even the social welfare project comes from an elite, comes in, build an institution, we'll see how it goes. So I think that there is this imagination of distance between state and people that was very much part of the minds of our founding fathers that then articulates itself. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on these two things.
Yeah, okay. Sure. So quickly, Priyadarshini's questions about the elite culture creating a myth around the leader. What's different today? The leader wants the myth. Okay. Just not a specialist in Modi, and therefore I'm not going to say more than that. Then why did the leaders of in this period, why did they say things that were completely impossible? Yeah, I like this question. But I also think that for the previous 50 years, they've been saying things that were completely impossible. And they'd been told they were impossible. Like they said, India should be independent, and the British said that's impossible. And they said, India can be united, and the British said that's not possible. And they had done these impossible things, really recently. And so they believed in themselves. There is some cynicism that creeps in, but in the first decade and a half, they had achieved so much. I think we forget. We take it for granted what they achieved, but it was a massive achievement, and they themselves gained confidence from that, and they also gained popular approval from that. Bypassing the administration and the creation of parallel structures, I mean, this is really interesting, this constant narrative of the administration is the problem, so we need to work around it. That dates from the colonial period. The British don't like their Leviathan Raj. Yeah, it's not a Leviathan. Yeah, it doesn't work for them in important ways. And so they're constantly creating parallel structures. What happens is the parallel structures eventually get absorbed. And are no longer parallel. At least that's what happens in the 50s and 60s. So Yamini's question. About the relationships between the state and the people. So I take your point that there are some things that they wanted the state to do to and for the people. And so therefore, I think there's this really interesting tension for them between what they want, which they say, and I do believe them, I take their words at face value here, they say they want a democratized administration, they want people to work for themselves, and yet the main tool they have at their disposal is the state. So it's a tricky dance for them to use the state to try to get the people to ask for the things that the state's willing to give them. I'm a little bit more forgiving of them, I think. But I think you're right, it's not quite active citizenship in the way that active citizenship is more ideal now. They had a very patronizing approach to the people. That is taken for granted. Taken as given.
Yeah, the gentleman. Yeah, and Suraj.
So, in light of your revisionist account, how do we read the statement that were coming from opposition leader? Is it possible to say that they were being sincere in their criticism, that their fear of this sort of erosion of private property rights, for instance, was genuine, or their fear that India was not getting as closer to West as they were supposed to be? So that is one question. And the second question is that when we are dealing with these public figures who have had very long and active life, we come across statements that are contradictory in nature. So in those contexts, how do we find what were the genuine intention behind them? For instance, I am reading Perkovich's book of India's nuclear program, and there are times when both Nehru and Shastri are saying that we are operating from a very strategic and economic cost-benefit logic when it comes to making decisions. And then there are times when they are giving a statement which says that we are driven by a very high-minded sense of idealism and moralism. So in terms of assigning causality, how do we make sense of the intentions behind these contrasting statements? Thank you.
Good questions, I like them.
Yeah, Suraj.
Sure, Suraj, why don't you ask yours and then I'll...
Hi, I have not read the book, so the question I ask might be profoundly silly. But Nehru was an autodidact in a manner that no Indian Prime Minister, maybe to a certain extent Narasimha Rao, but I mean he didn't really benefit much from that, ever was. So is there an essential Nehru that you are sort of building a mythos around and then critiquing? Or does Nehru change in terms of what he was looking at? Because at the time of independence, maybe India had like 1,500 grassroots leaders who had sacrificed for the country. Therefore, they had as much moral force as Nehru, and their endorsement probably carried the nation along. But if you look at like 1 or 2 generations down, that lot was gone. So I just want to know what prepared the ground for building this cult of Nehru. Was it because deifying him, Mrs. Gandhi could actually practice the opposite of what Nehru stood for, which is socialism and secularism. She hung out with the most rabid communal lot across religions, whereas Nehru never had any time for that. Nehru did not have to put secular and socialist in the Constitution of India. Mrs. Gandhi put it at the time she was violating those 2 basic principles. So, I mean, how does that work? How did Nehru evolve?
Yeah, okay. So let me take I'll take the questions in order. What about the opposition parties, especially the Swatantra Party, who argues that socialism is a route to the abolition of private property and the monopolization of all social, political, and economic life in India? That is their argument about socialism. What about their fear of India getting too close to the Soviet Union? Now, as a historian, it's not possible to get inside their head and tell if they're telling the truth or not, if they're lying to themselves as well as to the wider world. But I can tell you that I think it's an Oxford Union style debating tactic to exaggerate the threat in order to win the argument. And they get this style of debating not from the UK, but actually from the US and the neoliberal economists like Milton Friedman, who are fighting against the Keynesian state that it was built from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and arguing that any state intervention in the economy is the route to to authoritarianism. Yeah, and it's a debating tactic, I think. Now, how do we make sense of contradictory statements by these great figures, these very important people who shape institutions? Well, I think we mustn't demand a unity of thought in them that we don't have in ourselves, right? We must treat them as humans who can express, they might have multiple motives, some of which they express in one situation and others which they express in another, and they can change over time, and they can vacillate between them, and I think we have to accept all the contradictions in them in order to make sense of them, because if we try to make them coherent, and we're probably inventing a person rather than charting their history. I'm going to take your question and say that I think there is actually the original 7th chapter of the book was the myth that Indira ruined everything. Yeah? I think there's a little bit of misogyny there, right? Of course the women ruin things. But I think, her power was different from Nehru's, but not absolute either, as we've seen with the emergency. And so I don't think she ruined everything in the way that people think she does, but that's for somebody else to write a different book about. Oh yeah, so I think this is very interesting. So there are 1,500 or so congressmen and women on the ground who are an amazing generation of parliamentarians, and they're actually just watching them at work as you read the Lok Sabha debates is really, they're so erudite, they have a lot of integrity, they care deeply about the country, and they want to and they work with integrity to move things forward. And they die and they retire. And so part of the reason Nehru wants to retire by 1957 is his comrades are mostly gone, right? Azad in particular passes away just before he wants to retire in 1958. Azad passes away shortly before that. T.T. Krishnamachari is forced to resign shortly before that. So the quality of the cadre of Congress people has fallen after a decade. And then they're not really able to recover that, in part because the stakes are just not as high as do or die, are they? And so it's a different kind of person who comes into politics.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Taylor, for this wonderful conversation. And before we end, just one final question. As a historian, are you flattered by the contestation over modern Indian history that you see in India today?
I like that it's being considered history. So for years and years, I would come to India and people would say, "What do you do? Oh, you're a historian," and then they'd say, "What do you work on?" And I'd say, "Nehru's years," and they'd say, "That's not history."
Yeah, but that's clearly something which everyone enjoys. Thank you, each one of you, for being here and for being part of this wonderful conversation. And thank you so much, Taylor, for this wonderful talk.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.